very nice to see you all. Thank you very much for coming. And we don't have any power, which means two things. One, you do not get to see my beautiful slideshow with its immaculately timed and illustrated slides. And you have to look at me. I'm so sorry. And there's no power for a microphone, so I have to shout at you. Don't take it personally. As was said, I'm a co-director of an organization called the New Weather Institute. It's a think tank, a green think tank, a mixture of green economists and climate scientists and creatives as well. I also run a network of 200 NGOs called the Rapid Transition Alliance. And this talk that I'm giving you today very much comes out of all the different bits of work that we're doing at, because we're faced not only with the challenge of rapidly seeing through systems and behavior change, but also obviously having to deal with the climate change which is built into the system. And one of the most logical and natural responses to climate change, which has been so for as long as there has been life on Earth, is for living organisms to move when the climate changes. And interestingly, it's a little historical throw-in. One of the last great mass extinction events was known as the PETM, the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum. And we know from the fossil record that during the climate change that was a big part of that mass extinction, one of the issues was that climate zones were shifting at least 10 times faster than species were able to adapt and themselves move and reacclimatize in new zones. And already, not even allowing for how people's patterns of movement in the world are going to radically alter because of a shifting climate. Migration is already one of, if not the, defining issue of political fracture within this country, something which is being used both cynically, politically, in order to stay in power. And I thought there's no clearer example of the state we're in with regard to the issue than the fact of that, what's been dubbed the migrant barge, which is now anchored just off of Portland, which the Fire Brigades Union has said is a potential death trap. Now, obviously, the Fire Brigades Union, their job relies upon them keeping people safe from power. Grant Shapps, the government minister whose job it is to cling to power for as long as possible, has said, no, it's not a death trap. Now, I don't know who you want to believe, but I'm going to put my money with the Fire Brigades Union. So almost on a daily basis, issues related to migration are top of the agenda and at the fracture point in politics. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about, whenever it gets reported, this issue, it's heavily distorted. It's really hard to get a handle on what actually is the shape and the scale of the problem, its driving factors. So what I'm going to talk about in this session is give a little bit of an overview to get a feel for the size and the shape and the dynamics of the migration issue, including issues to do with refugees and asylum seeking, and then talk a little bit about what I consider to be a more true picture of how the UK relates to this issue, and for all the scaremongering about it and the sense, say a little bit about how the notion of people coming to this country because they have been forced to flee for whatever reason should be seen as a burden is entirely wrong. Entirely wrong. And part of the reason for that is the way that the UK has behaved economically, politically, militarily, in such a way as to create the conditions that make migration more likely and exacerbate the conditions which create asylum seeking and people who become refugees. So it's kind of a big sort of picture wrap to try and get a handle on this issue, to see where we are. And And just a tiny bit so you know who the hell I am. My name's Andrew Sims. Yeah, I've got this think tank with about 8 people, and I also assistant director for an organisation called Scientists for Global Responsibility. And of all the various campaigns, portfolio working, it's the modern thing, of all the various campaigns that I'm in, one of the other ones you might want to check out because it's quite fun. I see one of my colleagues sitting in the audience. Is called Badvertising. Badvertising, in which we're trying to do for the advertising of highly polluting products and services, fossil fuels, airlines, car makers, what the campaign to end cigarette advertising did for the tobacco industry. We're right in the middle of it at the moment, and there's actions that people can take. Look up badverts.org. That's a side plug, a bit of cross-marketing, but you know, you've got to take your opportunities when you can. So, so the situation, if I were to kind of try to encapsulate where we are with the situation of migration at the moment, as it sits in UK politics, and the way it sits in UK politics is not dissimilar to the way it sits in a lot of other OECD, fairly sort of wealthy country politics, is it's kind of an ultimate form of victim blaming by making it out as if the people who are forced to migrate or choose to migrate for whatever reason are the problem. And I wanted to start with a little bit of a historical throwback, because as is so often in politics, it's easy to forget how recent the dynamics of the politics of an issue are. Because you only have to go back a relatively short period of time when, to quote from the ILO in 1922, migration was, generally speaking, unhindered, and each migrant could decide on the time of his or her departure, his or her arrival, or return, to suit their own convenience. That was them commenting on the situation internationally for much of the 19th century. And things didn't really shift that much until after the First World War. During the First World War, there was a period of time in which borders became much more controlled, in which things that we would see today as passports were introduced. In fact, there was a conference set in 1920. It was called the Passport Conference, and it was to codify approaches to how people would cross borders. And this was the first time after that First World War that passports even became mandatory for many people. And yet it was done reluctantly. And this is the other extraordinary thing. People did it reluctantly in the face, or they said they were doing reluctantly in the face of the international conflicts and the problems that that had thrown up, the huge movements of people. But another thing which is easily forgotten is that right up until the 1960s, the norm in politics was that having to use passports was a nuisance and should be done away with. In fact, as recently as the 1960s, the proposal to ban passports was still being discussed by heads of state. So it's always good to remember, whether you're talking about the dynamics that created the climate crisis or things like the way that national borders are controlled. And I remember the first time that I discovered that, you know, when you grow up and you think kind of nations are innate, they're just there and they've been there for all eternity. I remember the first time somebody mentioned to me, like a passing remark when I was a teenager, about when Italy became Italy. And I thought, what do you mean? Italy wasn't always Italy? You know, the way that nations themselves are, as Benedict Anderson said, imagined communities. So when we think about having problems with migration and people forced to move across borders, it's a relatively recent thing. And up until relatively recently, governments, at least rhetorically, said that passports and passports controls were annoying, unnecessary things that needed to be done away with. So that's just a little bit of a kind of a historical marker. So what's the shape of the issue that we are faced with at the moment? Slide number 1, which you can't see, visual, paints picture. 1 in 30 people are migrants. Now, there's no universally agreed definition, but roughly people center around a migrant being a person who moves away from their place of usual residence for a variety of reasons, some of which we will come to. What's the current estimate? Well, it's thought that in 2020, there were about 281 million international migrants. Now that's up in 30 years from, it's more than doubled from the estimate in 1990, which was about 128 million. Now, of those, about 82 million have been forced to flee their home by one factor or another, meeting the tighter definition of a refugee, someone who has reason to believe that they are under threat. There are about 26.5 million are refugees. Half of those refugees, half, are under the age of 18. Now, the next myth that you come across in this debate when you read the newspapers, see the news, is the impression that's created that overwhelmingly it is countries like the UK who are carrying the can for hosting people who are migrants or refugees. This is absolutely not the case. The vast majority of refugees are hosted by developing countries. 86% are hosted by developing countries. And these are places like Pakistan, Colombia, Uganda, really major hosts for refugees. But then there's other issues as well, which are going to be at the heart of the human response to climate change. And that's internal displacement. Internal displacement is a massive issue and one which is harder to monitor, it's harder to pick up the numbers on. But just for a kind of a rough picture of it, in 2021, it was estimated there were about 38 million internally displaced people. And a big chunk of those, nearly 24 million of those, were the result of disasters. The rest were to do with conflicts. And here's where climate kicks in as a factor which is pushing the trend. Because in the past 10 years, 83% of all disasters have been triggered by natural hazards which were caused by extreme weather, climate-related events, things like floods and storms and heat waves. And the number of climate and weather-related disasters has been increasing steadily since the 1960s. It's gone up by about 35% since the 1990s. All the graphs, all the beautiful graphs that you see on this screen are heading in the wrong direction. So the proportion of all disasters attributable to climate and extreme weather events has also increased significantly during this time. It was about 76% of all disasters during the 2000s and up to about 83% during the 2010s. Some of the more recent figures, which are coming through from the early days of the pandemic, about 93% of disasters in the first 6 months of the pandemic were triggered by climate and weather-related factors. So you kind of get the picture. It's a big problem. It's muddied by the way that it's talked about in politics. There are many different reasons why people are either choosing or being forced to move, but their lives are being made extremely much more difficult, lethally so, which I'll come to, because of the hostile environments around the issue which has been created for political reasons and for political gain. Now, before he was the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Figueres had a big role in dealing with humanitarian issues. And he made the point, and these are his words, climate change is now found to be the key factor accelerating all other drivers of forced displacement. Most of the people affected will remain in their own countries. They will be internally displaced. But if they cross a border, they will not be considered refugees. These persons are not considered truly migrants in the sense that they cannot be considered migrants in the sense that they did not move voluntarily. As forcibly displaced, not covered by the refugee protection regime, they find themselves in a legal void. There is a protection gap in the international system that needs to be addressed. And of course, we're not talking about that because of the way the story is cynically used politically. We just talk about it as a sort of headline issue. And in terms of projections, two wildly different projections. According to the World Bank, by about 2050, there could be 143 million internal climate migrants. But, working in a slightly different discipline, you look at the work of people based at Essex University, a team of academics led by Professor Tim Lenton, and they've looked at the proportion of the human population globally that by about 2070 will be living in conditions where normal livelihoods cannot be supported, where you cannot grow food, where the temperatures are such that it does not allow you to effectively survive. And the estimate is quite a wide range, but even at the lower point of the range, it's huge, is that by 2070, between 1 and 3 billion people will be living in areas where the climate is so hostile that livelihoods cannot be supported. Now, the question, of course, is, if you're living somewhere where your livelihood cannot be supported, what are you going to do? Of course, you're going to move. And it's in a world in which we are fundamentally not only not prepared to deal with that, but in denial about it to the extent that we have Fortress Europe and we have the small boats policy in the UK. So everything pointing in the wrong direction. And at that point, I want to talk a little bit, as a British citizen, I want to talk a little bit about our own failures as a nation in this regard. The UK as a catalyst for the conditions created that make it more likely that other people will have to move and move against their will. And this is to do with the UK's role as a historical carbon emitter, the UK's role in arms sales, feeding international conflicts, the UK's role and its recent reneging on its legally obliged aid target that was, for what it's worth, even in the Tory party manifesto that they got elected on. I want to mention our colonial history as well, and the UK's highly selective dependence on migrant workers, and also the UK's economic role in the global economy as a kind of like major tax haven. So straight up, I forget exactly how many countries there are in the UN register, but it's like, is it 194 or 206 or something like that? But anyway, the UK as a historical emitter for its historical responsibility for climate change. We are 8th. We're a top 10 scorer. Go us in the international league table for those historically responsible for creating man-made climate change. We've also been part of, and with the retreat from our even already very modest contributions on the international front, the international community has been repeatedly failing to come up with the promised and paltry 100 billion annual climate finance to help the global south to adapt. 100 billion. Sounds like a shitload of money. But is it? When you consider that 100 billion is what goes on fossil fuel subsidies every 6 days. Every 6 days, globally, we're subsidizing the problem to the tune of 100 billion. And we can't even come up with 100 billion for a year's worth of climate finance for the whole of the global south. Now, in terms of what it would cost to help the global south adapt, it's a slightly old estimate from UNEP. Pitches it at about 70 billion a year, rising to between 140 and 500 billion a year in the global south between 2030 and 2050. So even at the higher range, you can see it's less than a tenth of the subsidies annually going to fossil fuels. Then we come to arms. Arms, and this is kind of one of the other profound reasons that people are forced to flee their homes. In the decade from 2010 to 2019, the UK government was the world's second biggest arms exporter. Cue slide of horrible-looking tanks and planes and stuff like that. UK companies signed contracts worth 86 billion worth of military equipment and services. 11 billion in 2019, down from about 14 billion the year before. Between 2011 and 2020, the majority of UK defence exports went to the Middle East. And in that period, we sold arms to 39 of 53 countries on a list of those with a record of abusing political and human rights. Now, I might be taking a step too far, but it looks like they're trying to collect the full set. And they won't be happy until they've sold arms to every single government that is abusing human and political rights. And we're selling arms to fuel conflicts, but cutting aid to countries that are hit by conflict. Before he became Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, in his 2020 spending review, announced that he was reneging on our legally binding 0.7 aid target, and they've been rowing back ever since. And the reality of that cut came through in 2021 when we saw aid to strife-torn Yemen facing cuts of nearly half, to Syria, cut 2/3, South Sudan, Libya, Sudan, all strife-torn countries facing major cuts. And at that point, I wanted to kind of like seg and tell you a little story. Cue picture of small South Pacific island that at first glance looks really cute. And then you look closer and you see the truth. I want to say a little bit about, it's actually been in the news for a number of reasons recently, weirdly, because it's only got a population of about 10, 12,000. It's called Nauru, and it's in the South Pacific. And Nauru was going along quite happily for hundreds and hundreds of years until in 1899, a man called Albert Ellis, who was a mining prospector, was in the office of his company in Australia when he saw an odd-looking rock holding open a door. And he thought, aye, Australian dollar signs, or whatever the currency was. Were they using British pounds then? I don't know. Money signs in his eyes, because what he recognized was a highly rich form of fossilized phosphate, the product of basically bird shit accumulating on land over millennia. And he thought, I wonder where that came from, because if I can find that island, it's going to make me very rich. And he did. And the next year, he went to Nauru, one of 3 such islands that have got this strange anomaly that they were home to migrant birds. They had really big bird populations of ages. And they were just a whole island built up of this fossilized guano. And so business began. These exceptional phosphate-rich rocks. And Nauru at the time was under the colonial administration of Germany. He struck a deal. They started mining. You can probably kind of guess what happens next. There was a population increase. The island was mined over a period of decades to virtual exhaustion. The indigenous population of Nauru saw a tiny fraction of the income from the sale of that phosphate that went out on to fertilize the agricultures of Australia and the British Empire and beyond, leaving Nauru an island with a little rim around the edge where people were kind of clinging to some existence, and the whole of the center of the island excavated and like a moon-like wasteland. Albert Ellis, for his endeavours, obviously was given a knighthood and appointed Commissioner for New Zealand with the British Phosphate Commission. Just 2% of the capital generated went back to the island. But it wasn't just that, it was also kind of like administered by the colonial administrations, and which they had to pay for. They had to pay for the administration of that as well. Long story, jump forward almost a century, and Kinza Klodjuma, who was president of Nauru from 1997 to 1998, said this, with regret: "What was once a tropical paradise was changed to a jagged, inhabitable desert of coral tombstones. Our sad history serves as a poignant example for the rest of the world of what can happen when humans disregard the good earth that sustains us." Now, Nauru is highly vulnerable to sea level rise and climate change, like many of the small South Pacific islands. And of course, there are so many ways, there's so many threads to this story. But as it stands as an example, of course, people from Nauru, if push came to shove, could potentially migrate. When we do what was done to Nauru, to the planet as a whole, we have nowhere else to go. But then the story doesn't end there, because shortly after that comment from the president of Nauru, a couple of years later, Australia, in response to its issue with migration, struck a deal with Nauru in a plan that I still find extraordinarily Australia called its Pacific Solution. Anyone with a memory of the Second World War will not miss the connotation. I mean, just extraordinary that they could have the insensitivity to call it that. And their plan was to intercept as many people seeking to get to Australia, to seek either refugee status or just to migrate there, and hold them on Nauru. And the conditions on Nauru, described a little bit of what the island was like, were appalling. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International described them as indefinite misery, that they were inhuman. The Australian Minister for Immigration likened their imprisonment to a holiday in paradise. The health problems, the suicides, the hunger strikes that followed were extraordinary. Now, the last person who was held on Nauru has recently been moved. The island has got caught up because it's so small and it's so dependent and it relies entirely upon sort of external investment, has been used by a Canadian mining company to push for a first phase of a kind of deep sea mining for rare earth minerals, which are now in great demand. And also, even more bizarrely, I'm gonna have to read this one to you. Even more bizarrely, it just goes to show the kind of the power imbalances that occur between small island states and developing countries and others. But do you remember recently in the news one of those crazy Bitcoin things that sort of went pear-shaped? It was a currency sort of trading bit called FTX. There was a guy called Sam Bankman-Fried. Sam Bankman-Fried has a younger brother. I just stumbled across this the other day, as if Nauru hasn't had enough trouble already. Sam Bankman-Fried's younger brother, who was a top lobbyist for failed crypto exchange FTX, considered purchasing the island nation of Nauru to create a fortified apocalypse bunker state. He was looking at buying Nauru in the event where 50 to 99.99% of people die. Note, to protect his philanthropic allies and create a genetically enhanced human species. Batshit stuff happens when you're poor. You know, it's bizarre. There are other dimensions to the fact that some of the people who are working in the mines in Nauru came from Tuvalu. Tuvalu is another really, really low-lying South Pacific island that back in around about 2000, it was already losing parts of its outer atoll. And it applied to Australia to ask for a planned, orderly, over a long period of time, migration agreement. And Australia, who were using Nauru, where the people from Tuvalu were working the mines, told them where to go. These issues, they wrap around and they wrap around and they get darker and darker as you go. So back to the... About 15 minutes, right. Okay, I'm going to speed through the last bit and then we'll kind of throw it open for a bit of a discussion. So a little bit more about the kind of the UK's role. Of course, the great irony is that in the modern global economy, money and goods and stuff move really easily. People don't. Weird things happen when money and stuff moves easily and people don't. The economist Ha-Joon Chang points out that in a world that's geared to the free movement of money and goods, but with restrictive immigration policies, it means like a bus driver in Sweden can get paid 50 times more than his or her counterpart in India for doing a probably less stressful and demanding job. So why wouldn't you want to move? The economic logic of neoliberalism bizarrely does not support restrictions on migration. But are we a grateful nation for all the services, for all the care, for all the work that's done by people who have come to Britain to keep Britain moving? People who are foreign born represent about 18% of the UK employed population. In hospitality, it's about 75% of waiting staff, 25% of chefs, 37% of housekeeping staff come from the EU. In tourism, 16% of non-British nationals. In health, 15% non-British. In education, 12% of school staff in England born outside the UK. In the food industry, 143,000 EU nationals. The Refugee Council estimate that about 1,200 medically qualified refugees are recorded on the British Medical Association's database, and that it would cost about $25,000 to support a refugee doctor to practice in the UK. Training a new doctor is estimated to cost between $200,000 and $250,000. There are policy failures that fuel hostility towards migrants and refugees in this country. In housing, in finance, Brexit, and the level of investment in low-carbon transition. In housing, the pitiful failure to build social housing, which in the 50s and the 60s, we were building between 200 and 250,000 social homes a year. In 2020, 6,500. There's over 1 million people waiting for social housing. As a consequence of the artificially politically imposed cuts, ever since the financial crisis, and even more since COVID, school funding, funding for leisure amenities, funding for libraries gets cut. We have a policy approach that creates a sense of disenfranchisement among people on low income in this country, and then a political establishment and a media that either subtly or unsubtly points the finger of blame at the burden of people coming to this country, in spite of the fact that those people are helping to make this country tick, to make this country work, to care for your and my relatives. So it's used as a way of kind of like distracting. What do we do about it? And I'll wrap up with this. What do we do about it? At the very basic level, and this is where the UK is being criticised at the moment with its both its Rwanda policy, and the Rwanda policy was just possibly the most kind of disgraceful bit of performative political theatre to distract attention and point the finger elsewhere. And people in Westminster, it's all kind of like knockabout for them. But the consequence of these Fortress Europe, Fortress Britain policies are lethal. There's an organisation called United that tracks documented deaths of people who've been forced to flee, migrants. And from 1993 to this year, they have documented over 52,000 deaths as a consequence of people being forced to flee, as a consequence of Fortress Europe policies. So at the very least, as a country, we need to uphold our legal obligations for protection of resources. I would argue that people who are forced to flee for climate push factors, given that the consequence of the responsibility for that is overwhelmingly on the rich world and countries like the UK, that climate refugees should be given afforded the same protection as conventional refugees. We need to accept our national responsibilities and act to reverse those push factors. And again, we are doing exactly the opposite in this country at the moment. One little thing you could do, as Britain is a kind of a tax haven, one of the world's biggest tax havens, you know the Robin Hood tax? Don't know if you know the Robin Hood tax. It's a proposal that a tax should be placed on foreign currency transactions. This is the huge, vast trillions that swill around the global markets on a daily basis. Even if you put a really small tax on those transactions, you can raise a very large amount of money. I think there will be a certain poetic unity in taxing the free movement of capital in such a way that we could actually pay to care for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. That's one thing we could. That money is not an issue in this. It's only an issue if people don't want to pay. The money is out there. And I also think, and this is where I've been incredibly heartened, and I see it on a daily sort of weekly basis, even in my sort of areas in South London, is the number of people who have organised into the welcome movement. And there is nothing more that restores your faith in humanity than people who are now going out of their way against the opprobrium of the inflammatory rhetoric from Westminster and the tabloids to openly welcome people who come to this country for whatever reason. And we've got to recognise the contributions of migrants, asylum seekers and refugees to this country, because one of my former jobs for many, many years was policy director of the New Economics Foundation. And it's the other thing which is overlooked, the other story which is not told. People who come to this country from somewhere else make disproportionately positive economic contributions to the UK economy. Invariably, they are the people who will go into a more depressed neighbourhood, start up small businesses, get a neighbourhood up to the point where other, brands see the benefit of moving into a neighbourhood and push others out. So we need to recognise the economic, the cultural contributions, the contributions to the key services, to our communities and our economy. And most of all, and I'll finish on this point, and then we can just have a discussion however you like. Most of all, we need to call out the lying representation of the issue around migration and refugees and asylum seeking in this country, because without that, we will not make the changes in order to be able to make the transition such that we can all share in relative harmony this still fabulous little planet that we've got, which is the only one that we've got, and the one place that we cannot migrate away from. So thank you very much for listening, even if you were only sheltering from the rain, and we'll take it from there.